rent out its space, Limoncello being viable. I don't see this being constructive, but I'm only speaking for myself.
Yeah, no, I think we're pretty well, it's the consensus of the board, we want to...
You might want to rethink the motel, hotel situation. You know, when you have all these medical diagnostic facilities, people they need a place to stay overnight. So are you really saying that you only want one motel in all of Goshen? You're going to restrict the business of the...
I'm saying that I don't see a conference center. I think that's what we were talking about. The conference center is not something that I see.
Right now, there's no limitation on the number of motels under the current ordinance. There was only a limitation on the number
on
of
the conference center.
But the ordinance, but it's only in the IP zone, though?
Correct.
Remember, I think that's the only zone where motels are allowed.
So that's very limited then. You really are limited just by virtue of that it's only allowed in that zone. Well, I know the planning board will look at it, but I think it's food for thought if you want to restrict it. You're basically restricting the number of motels in the village.
Yeah.
And is that's your intention, or would you rather have business regulate itself?
Well, I have a problem difficulty with inundating main corridors with motels. I would rather be selective, and whatever verbiage, I think that restricting it to the IP as it currently is does contain the number. If you want to bring up something else for us to talk about, then I'm sure you'll raise it in your comments for us to talk about.
Yeah,
but as far as the conference center goes, I do not support the conference center at this point at all.
Actually,
that's what we'd have to look at, is where exactly it would be allowed, how many...
Well, that's outside of this law, except for the removal of the, you're talking about a broader issue.
Yeah.
Whether or not hotels or hotel
Right.
conference centers should be allowed, and if so, where and what.
Yeah, that would be...
I look forward to the conversation.
they are allowed in the design shopping.
Okay, so they are
Okay.
in
Well, that one.
Okay,
Yeah.
we're just talking about this for now.
Right, I know.
Okay,
Well, then they are allowed in another area
okay, good.
along connector
Way
road.
down, along the southern.
Along the connector road.
Yeah, I have a question about number 7.
All right, that's where we are, yep, okay.
It's the typical of the other uses we have in here. It starts out fine, professional or business offices, I know what that is. Unrelated to a specific medical use with no associated warehouse facility. That goes off on all kinds of...
Well, the unrelated specific medical use seems like it's not really needed.
Yeah, why don't it just say professional or business office?
We know we have.
Yeah, they could say that. It was put in because it was restricted in the permitted uses. So this would be the offices, that would be a special permit.
Right, you could have a law.
It was expanding or explaining, I guess. But the last part, Mal, came out of a discussion that we had.
We didn't want to turn it into...
Right.
An office building, because we do have a lot, maybe more in Rockland than here, I don't know, but you have those buildings with offices and warehouses in the back or warehouses on the view.
Right.
And we didn't want
I mean,
that.
that's not what we're looking for.
Well, we've discussed that too. We could say professional business offices, leave it at that, and you won't rent any.
Well, that's true.
Because the ones that we have now aren't.
Aren't being rented, yeah. Okay, so what's everybody's pleasure on number 7?
I just think we should take the middle phrase out, unrelated to a specific medical.
Yeah, that's, and keep there with no associated warehouse facilities. Is that fine with everybody?
Yep.
Okay.
Can I add one other that you need to consider, and that is whether or not religious use should be allowed in the OVH zone. You would put that off to the side while you talked about the religious use law.
Well, I think we may want to consider that. Obviously, we've still got to deal with...
You can keep it into the heading of the other law, but during the period of the moratorium, you were putting off consideration of whether or not the OVH, if I remember correctly, was going to be one of the places where religious uses would be allowed. And since you're going to also talk about the religious use law tonight, and if you're coming to conclusion on this, you may want to consider whether the religious use is appropriate for the OVH zone as well.
It's specifically not in here.
What?
It's specifically not.
It's specifically not allowed
It
now.
probably fits under the heading of the other law, but,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, then that goes back to holistic care, for example. So who's a religiously based holistic care center?
as I've said to you before, when you allow a religious use, the number of accessory components that come with it have been broadly read by the courts and could include an awful lot of things.
Yeah.
And you need to be realistic when it comes to that.
I think for right now, I'd like to leave it as it is. It's only my, and because we're dealing with it in that other law. What's everybody else's opinion?
Have we addressed the issue yet at all?
Yeah, no, well, we're gonna address the religious use, so,
So we'll have to address OVH.
yeah, and we will have to do it at that time if it's needed. All right?
So we move on to the other one?
I guess, yeah, for the time we have left, we'd like, I guess if nobody's got a...
You're gonna meet by Zoom.
Yeah,
Residential feel of Greenwich as you allow it realistically as you must to convert to some kind of commercial or business uses. Students had familiarity with that, and they see our residential district and the town now village of Woodbury trying to achieve some of those objectives. Also, there needs to be some sensitivity paid to how we handle those uses, particularly CS-type uses, to the residential properties that, at least on the uphill side of Greenwich, are the immediate backdoor neighbors. Stu had also covered that the CR zoning district requires certain kinds of visual screening from headlights and buffering and things like that. Those, I think, were probably the most important parts of why the planning board has been pushing for the longest time to separate out Greenwich from West Main. Less in terms of use, but I'm sure there may be use issues there as well. But the bulk table stuff just doesn't work.
It doesn't fit.
Completely different places.
Yeah.
So I don't think it has to be, if it isn't CSOB, I think it means that it should be something else. And maybe you should listen carefully to the property owners that will tell you what the marketplace is like in terms of what uses might fly. But I don't know that it has to either be OB or CS. Recognize also that the reason why we talked about splitting it off was the direction in which the current draft of the religious use law is going. That is trying to track the city of Yuma case that would allow some of the restrictions that are in that to the limited downtown area that has virtually no off-street parking and has eating and drinking establishments and the West Main Street corridor in particular. The planning board had no difficulty, Elaine, again, correct me if I'm wrong, with the upper end, meaning up by the bank and the traffic light remaining CS, because the character of those buildings is largely like West Main Street. It had some discussion about how far down Greenwich the shift should be, where it leads DS, how that should be handled, but I think the largest thing they wanted to bring to your attention, and it's not necessarily fighting what others have told you about what are appropriate uses, but if you shape something here, it really has to take into consideration the reality of that street being very different than West Main. Some attempt to allow the existing residential style buildings that still remain to convert to some kind of commercial uses that will endeavor to protect, remember, it's still all ADD out there.
Correct.
The look of those buildings, and yet realistically allow some kind of commercial uses. It doesn't have to be straight office. The village has a lot of OB office space, and many times we've been very lucky. We have some lulls here and there, but in the good times we have an insatiable appetite for office, and there's no doubt we fill it. But I don't know that we want nothing but office at this village. Maybe some flavor of some of the CS uses, maybe even all of them might work. But anyway, that's, I think, the flavor of what the planning board wanted to convey in its report. But I just wanted to point out, it isn't necessarily an either or. It may mean crafting something else. And I know Stu has had some experience with doing that, and might be able to work some magic.
Well, it's a good point. I mean, we came up with this initial idea to achieve certain objectives, but that corridor has, in addition to the points you make, it has a very distinct physical characteristic, so that it's harder to develop those properties, and you don't necessarily want to develop those properties as CS because of the old buildings, the topography, etc. So maybe it's possible to craft a zone that would fit much of that corridor. I know some of the corridor closer in where Healy's is, there's the flatter parcels and bigger parcels that make it a little tricky. But maybe think about even more residential or mixed-use type uses in there too. I mean, that's now there's a provision, I think, in the zone that allows the conversion of residential buildings, but it doesn't really